One of the most popular and frequently used front-end development frameworks is Angular. The market for recruiting Angular engineers has gotten more competitive as the popularity of this technology has grown. As the demand for professional and experienced Angular programmers grows, more countries are looking to expand their Angular development workforce. Hello guys, I'm Bhavita, and I welcome you to the tutorial on the latest version of Angular. In today's session, we'll be covering all the new features in this version. So without further ado, let's go ahead and look into the agenda for today. We're going to start off the session by understanding the building blocks for web development, and then move ahead and have a quick introduction on Angular. Next, we'll look into the Angular architecture further. We'll understand how we can install Angular. Next, we'll see about Angular CLI and setting up Angular on our system. Next, we'll look into the files and file structures. We'll then look at components, templates, modules, derivatives, dependency injection. Next, we'll look into the routing and Angular forms. Next, we'll see how we can test in Angular and then have a look at final demonstration. Next, we'll learn everything that we learned today in brief and close this session. But before we go ahead, make sure you're subscribed to the Edureka YouTube channel and hit the notification bell to never miss an update. Also, if you're interested in online training certification, do check out the link given in the description box below. Now let's go ahead and start with learning about building blocks of web development. Now to develop any particular website, there are certain common and basic things that we have to keep in our mind. So the most important thing for developing any website is the look of the website. Now how do we do that? We use something called as HTML. Most of us are already familiar with it. Now, since you have come here to learn about a particular framework, it's important that you know the basics of JavaScript. Now, JavaScript is something that will help you verify, validate all your forms and web applications that you create. Now, this is being done by certain frameworks these days. One such framework is Angular. Now, next is CSS, and this is used for styling our websites. So, HTML basically provides basic structure for your sites. Now, CSS in JavaScript is used for enhancing and modifying these websites with usage of other technologies. So basically, CSS is used to control the presentation and formatting of the layout, as I've mentioned already. And next, JavaScript controls the behavior and different elements in our web application. Now, since Angular is a JavaScript framework, let's learn more about JavaScript. So basically, it is a text-based programming language which will allow you to construct interactive web pages on both client and server side. Now, before frameworks existed, JavaScript was creating interactive web pages only through client side. Now, after the eruption of frameworks and Node.js, we can create both on client side and server side. Now, speaking of HTML and CSS, they basically provide structure and aesthetic web pages. Now, JavaScript adds interactive components that keep users engaged. Now, since we've spoken so much about JavaScript, it's high time that we get introduced into frameworks. So as I mentioned, frameworks make our work easy. They basically cover all the concepts that otherwise you need code redundancy while just creating using JavaScript. Now on course, we have numerous frameworks that has been developed. So the majorly used framework is React, Angular, and many more. So JavaScript frameworks basically are pre-written JavaScript programming libraries that may be used to perform common programming operations and activities. Now it's a framework for building web pages, web applications, etc. Now as I mentioned, React.js, Angular, jQuery, Node.js are commonly known frameworks which are widely in use. With that, let's go ahead and have a quick introduction to Angular. Now, Angular is basically an application design framework and development platform for creating efficient and sophisticated single pages application. Now here, I might also add that now with enhancement of software, including single page applications, there are multi-page applications being created on course. Now, Angular is basically a development platform built on TypeScript. TypeScript is a programming language or a JavaScript built language. Now, this also includes component-based framework, well-integrated libraries, a suite of developer tools which will help you build, test, develop, and update all of your code. Now let's go ahead and look at Angular architecture. Now, as you can see from this diagram, Angular architecture most commonly consists of templates, components, directives, metadata, router services. And they also are connected with each other. Now, binding agents are most important things that binds each of the components with each other. Something like property binding, event binding are some of the important things that you have to keep in mind. There is also data binding. Now, as you know, our primary goal is to build client-side application with HTML and TypeScript. Well, for that, the most used basic building blocks for Angular is ng module. We'll learn more about it in the upcoming slides. For now, going through the architecture, as I've already mentioned, templates, components, derivatives, and metadata and router services are some of the important things. Now, templates basically combines HTML with Angular derivatives. And we have components which define many views arranged in hierarchical order. And then we have router services that can be used to find navigational paths among various of your application, as router provides sophisticated in-browser navigational capabilities. Now, metadata here is for component class, which associates itself with templates and define a particular view. Now, another thing about Angular is it's basically an MVC architecture, a model, view, and controller. So here what basically model does is, it is the lowest level of pattern responsible for maintaining data. Now speaking of view, it is responsible for displaying all or a portion of data to the user. And controller is basically a software code that controls the interactions between model and view. And this is how overall Angular architecture works. Now with that, let's go ahead and see what are the features for Angular architecture. So basically, Angular is a component-based architecture, which means everything in Angular or every code structure is divided based on components. Now again, it is independent and self-sufficient. We do not need help of any other programming language, and everything in Angular is self-sufficient and self-built. Next, it is extremely compatible in browsers and mobiles and even tablets for that matter. And then it's highly syncable with client and server side of content, no matter what size or what kind of content that is. With that, let's look into the installation of Angular. Now for that, let's look into the prerequisites that we need in order to install. So basically, we need TypeScript. Now TypeScript is a type of scripting language that is required in order to start our Angular programming. Next, we need Node.js. Make sure you have Node.js installed. Next, for command line interface, now in order for our outputs to run hassle-free, we need to have command line interface Angular CLI installed. Next, make sure you install all the packages with npm. With that, we can start with our Angular project. So let's go ahead and install all these. Now let's go ahead and install our requirements. So for installing our requirements, first thing that we need to do is, I'm going to go here and just say Node.js. Now here, just go to this and just have a look at which version you are using. Whichever is compatible with your system, go ahead and download it. Now since my system is using 64-bit, I'm going to install this. Now after you install this, you'll get a bunch of messages which you'll have to accept. Now once you accept, your Node.js will be installed. Now to check that, we'll have to go to our command prompt and check for our version. Let's do that. Now here in my command prompt, I'm just going to say npm space -v. Here, I can have a look at my version of my Node.js installed. Now as you can see, my version is being displayed here. Now this means I have 6.14.13 version of Node.js being installed. Now next step is to set up our TypeScript and install our command line interface. Let's go ahead and do that. So before I get started with installing anything, I need to mention here that I'm using Visual Studio Code as my editor. Now you can choose any editor of your preference. I'm just going to go ahead and start with my installation. I'm going to say new terminal, and here I have created a folder called as project, just a basic simple folder with nothing. And here I'm going to install my TypeScript. And for that, the command that I use is npm install -g G is for generate TypeScript. Now this will generate my TypeScript, and I'll have my TypeScript ready to start with my project. I'm just going to hit enter. Now this might take quite a while. Now after this is done, the next step is to install our Angular CLI. Now for that, the command used is npm install -g, again G is for generate, at angular/CLI. Now if you want the latest version, you can go ahead and say at latest. Now this will give you the latest version as well. I'm just going to hit enter. Again, this is going to take quite a while. Now with this done, we can go ahead and create our project. So all our installation is done here. So let me create the project. For that, the command used is ng new and the name of the project. I'm going to say demo. Again, this is going to take quite a while. Now here, as you can see, there is an exception thrown here. Now for that, you have to always keep in mind, when you open the terminal, even though you install everything, make sure you jump into command prompt, because any command that you give to your Angular, it will process only when it is given in your command prompt. So make sure your PowerShell is being converted into command prompt. Now I'm going to go ahead and give the same command in order for my project to be installed. I'm going to say ng new and demo. Say enter. Now there'll be a bunch of files that will be auto-loaded here. And once everything is done, our project will be created. For that, it's going to ask a couple of questions, which is Angular routing, if you want routing to be involved. Now, since we are covering routing in our today's session, I'm going to go ahead and say yes. Also, for styling purposes, since we are using CSS, I'm going to say enter. Now, all our project files will be created. Now, while our installation is in process, let's quickly learn about Angular CLI. Since we've already installed Angular CLI, it's vital for us to know what is command line interface in Angular. So basically, we need Angular CLI because it is a vital tool for us to initialize, develop, maintain any particular Angular application in our command shell. Now, all command that we give to our Angular application is via our command shell. It is important for us to have command line interface in Angular. Now with that, as we've already seen, we have installed our Angular CLI. Now let's go ahead and proceed with our project. Now that all our packages and everything required for us to start with our project is being installed, let's go ahead and see how it looks. But for that, we need to redirect ourselves into the project that we just created. So my project name is demo. So I'm going to say cd, which means I'm redirecting myself to demo, cd demo. Just hit enter. So we'll get into this particular file. Now, the command for us to connect to the server and have a view at our application is ng-serve. Now, there are multiple commands for this. ng-serve is something that has been used. Also, in order for us to directly open into our web page, we can say ng-serve space --o or even open. This will open our web page directly. Now the port number that has been generally used is localhost 4200. So let's go ahead and hit enter and we'll see how it looks from our front end. Now as you can see, the application bundles are being bundled together. This is being generated, and once everything is being generated, it'll say compiled successfully and it'll redirect us to the port. Now as you can see here, it says compiled successfully. And also it is showing in my browser. Now let's go ahead and have a look at it. Now as you can see, this is the project that we created. All these files are auto-installed by our application. Now this is something that is generated, but we are going to change on course with our application. So this is how our bare minimum application looks when we create a project using installations. So let's go ahead and move further in our tutorial. So the next thing is to look at the files and folder structures in our Angular. It's important to understand how our files and folders are being arranged in order to proceed further. So let's go ahead and look at it. So when you create an Angular project, you'll have bunch of files that has been loaded into our project. So the first thing, you have something called as node modules. Node modules is an auto-generated file structure which is generated when you compile. So whenever you give the compilation command, this file structure is being loaded in order for us to connect with the server. Now, you don't have to work with it, so I'm just going to leave it as it is. The next thing that is very important is the source folder. Now, everything that you want to code and every file that is present in the source folder. Now, styles.css is a whole styling sheet, and if you want to change the structure and the outlook of your application in a whole, you can give all your stylings over here. Next is the main TypeScript file. Here, all the imports and all the packages that we need for our application and our platform to work hassle-free is given here. Next, we have the main HTML file, which is index.html. All the components, all the root routing components is being given here. Whenever a component has been created, our component is being rendered over here by its name tag. Now we'll get into that in our components section. For now, all we have to know is the title for our icon and image, which is auto-generated, is being present in our index.html. Now next, we have main folder, which is app. Now app folder contains all our components, and whichever component we'll be creating here is being created in the form of folders inside our app folder. Now app folder also contains our main module TypeScript file, component TypeScript file, and component HTML file along with component CSS file. All these are root components. Now component has a root component, which is a major component that has been treated as a parent component, and each and every component that has been created after this is treated as child component. We'll look more into it in our component section. For now, it is important for us to know that every component routing file, app file, component TS file belongs to the root component called app.component, and hence the TS, HTML, and CSS file. Now with that, we can proceed ahead and get into our components section. Now speaking of Angular components, so here as you can see, we have considered component and template. Now from the diagram, you can make out that it is a part of architectural diagram. So the usage of components basically keeps the code clean and separates the view from other parts. Now each component has a tree of elements. So firstly, we have HTML template. Now this basically declares what renders onto your page. Next, we have TypeScript, which basically is a set of code that defines the behavior of your application. So metadata here keeps the code clean and helps in styling. So basically it uses CSS Selector for your styling purposes. Now there are many events here like binding event, property binding. So these are basically events that has been used to interact with components and templates. So they interact and pass data between each other using these particular bindings. Now let's move ahead. So since we've been speaking about template and component, it's vital to know what is the relationship between template and component. So there is a huge relationship here. Basically, speaking of template is something that helps in creation of component. Now there is a hierarchical view defined by a particular component that has been hosted by other components. So a companion template will always define a component's view. Now this means template is a form of HTML which will tell Angular how to render a particular component. Now let's go ahead and see the variety of components here. There's something called as header component. Header component basically tells how we can embed a view in any particular application. So say for example, you're displaying an email application. Now, if you want to keep your inbox separate, all your menus separate, and any other thing on your application separate, each of it is considered as a component, and all this has been done by a header component. So as you can see, there is a component body, component header, and component sidebar. All this in combination is basically known as header component. Now, next we have something called as component input data. So as I already spoke about events, there should be a data transfer between each of the components. Now here we're going to speak of data transfer between a parent component and a child component. Now, as we already saw in our application, root component is the app component. Now that is considered as your parent component. Let's say the component that you will be creating is your child component. Now, in order for us to transfer data from each other, we use something called as input and output. So let's see how these steps are involved. So basically, passing data from parent to child is called binding. Now, to interpret input property changes, we are going to process it by a setter. Now, if you want to change any particular property, you use something called as ng-on-changes. Now, parent always listens to a child's event. If you're creating any particular event in a particular child component, then parent has to listen to it. Now, this is all done by a local variable. So, local variable is being created, and using that variable, your parent will interact with your child. Now, parent always calls the child by a view function. This is called as view child. Now, parent and child communication is by using service. How do we create service? We'll learn further ahead in our session today. Next, we have something called as dynamic components. So basically, in dynamic components, it is being loaded programmatically in two different ways. First way is by using ngF, and the second way is by using dynamic component loader. So in ngF, we use an embedded selector. Now we can create a selector and call the component by that. Now while in our dynamic component loader, we have to create a code that has been developed in DOM. Now this is done by a developer. While in that of ngF, we can control it and we can add it to DOM if needed. So now this can be managed. So preferably we use ngF. Now let's go ahead and see some of the use cases of our components. So there is a huge benefit of using components in real time. Now the first one being in-browser navigation. Here, as I mentioned earlier, components ranges from router services which will eventually help you define navigational paths among views, and hence it can be used to provide in-browser navigations. Now the other thing is web component ecosystem can be maintained. So this is done by providing coordination between frameworks, and which will in turn help us to maintain web component ecosystem. So all this done, it can make it more reusable as well. Now with that, we'll go ahead and see how we can create components and see what can be done by these components. Now before we create our component, let's look at our app component here. Now going into our TypeScript file here, you can see there's something called as component. Now this is called as decorator. Now with this component decorator comes a bunch of our component files that has been loaded here, which is our selector, our template URL, and style URLs. So basically style URLs stores our CSS file. Now any of our styling can be done in our app.component.css file, which belongs to our component itself, but it's a CSS file. Now next we have template URL, which stores our HTML file. Now basically not just in file, you can give inline templating as well. If not for storing the file, you can basically give your HTML code here, which is called as inline templating, which we'll address in our templates. Now, this is about our template URL. Next, we have selector. Now, app root is the selector that has been used in order for us to render this particular component. Where is this used? Well, this is used in index.html. As you can see, in index.html, we call that particular component by rendering that particular selector as a tag. Now, this is being used as tag, and this will be rendering our component. This will come and trigger this. So, this is about our component. Similarly, if you create a component, the same thing will be happening here. Let's go ahead and see how this is done. So I'm going to come here, just say Control C. Yes, I'm just canceling my connection. Here, what I'm going to do is, now make sure you're inside your directory. I'm going to create the component by this command, ng, g, which means generate, c is for component, and your component name. So I'm going to say my component name as demo component. Again, it's any name that you want to give. Hit enter. Again, it might take a while as there'll be a bunch of files that has been loaded. Now, once that has happened, our component will be created. Now, as I've already discussed, the component that I created here will be treated as a child component. Now, which is our parent component? It is our app component. So parent component mostly will stay as app component as it is the root component to all our hence created components. Right, now let's wait for it to be created. As you can see, once our components is being created, you can see some of the things that's happening here. The first thing is that our HTML file is loaded and hence our TypeScript, CSS. Now there's something called a spec TypeScript, which is a specification file which is used for our compilation purposes, which we won't touch anyway. After that, just notice here, there has been update made to our app module.ts. Now here in our module, whenever a component is being added, there will be an update made. What is that update? Let's go ahead and see that. Now, I'm sure you wouldn't have noticed it, but the update made is our import has been added here. As you can see, our import statement will trigger our module to recognize our component hence added. Now, whichever component is present, including our routers, will be imported in our module. Now, whenever this import is being done, make sure your imports tag is being added over here as well. As you can see, the component that I created is demo component. Now, component is suffix that has been added to any of the component name that you create. So it was not needed that I add demo component, but just to avoid confusion for both demo and demo component here, I just created it as demo component. Now this is the change that has been made in our module.ts. Now sometimes if our application fails to make these changes, make sure you do it by yourself. Always add a tag over here, declare your component that you just defined, and importing is something that is very important. Now next, let's go ahead and see how we can make changes in our components. So here in our component, like I mentioned, just like our root component, there are three main files: a CSS file, HTML file, and our TypeScript file. As you can see, thanks to our Angular CLI, everything that you want is being preloaded. Now again, in our selector, we need to do something that we might have missed. If you can remember, we have to use this particular selector, go to our index.html, call it as a tag. Why this should be done? In order for it to render this particular component. So let's go ahead and copy the selector. Now go to index.html, paste it here, close it. Now this will be treated as our component. Now why don't we just see how this works in our browser, right? So before that, if you remember, there was this that was being added. Just gonna say this, yes, and save this. And let's go ahead and check our browser. Now here in my browser, going to refresh this. Oh, of course, we didn't run our command for compilation. So always make sure you run your command for compilation. Now before we do that, there's something else that I have to mention here. Whenever you render your tag in your index.html, make sure you render the tag in your main root component as well, because we want it to be responsive and being displayed in our browser. So I'm going to call my tag here as well. Now I'm expecting the message to be demo component works. Let's see if that will happen. I'm just going to say ng serve. Now if you want the browser to be open, you can say --open or --o. I'll just say ng serve. Now as you can see, it has been compiled and I've got my message, which means our component works perfect. Now let's go back and see what else can we do for our components. Now, as I've already mentioned, you can give something called as inline template. Of course, we'll look into that in our template section, but let's look into our styles. Now here in styles, what we can actually do is we can give this as a class also. Now here what we've treated this is as file, but let's treat it as class and then see what happens. Now for our templates, we can actually give this templates as a class also. Now we'll do that in our template section. For now, let's see and change the selector. So basically selector we've used as tag. Now since we've used it as tag, we've determined it as tag in all the files that we are sending for render. Now what I'll do is I'll use this as a class. So let's go ahead and define this as class. I'm just going to say this dot, and similarly what we're going to do is we're going to define this as a class. So for that I am going to call a div tag, and say class equal to, what is our selector name? App demo component. Close the div tag, just save it. It should work. Let's go back to our browser and check. As you can see, works the same. Now, these are the ways that you can basically render your component. Let's see what else can be done. Now, say what if I want to give my selector as attribute? So for that, as you can already say, I am going to enclose this with a square bracket. Now to give this as attribute, I am going to say square bracket, and here I'm going to call my selector, save this. Similarly, go ahead, change this and call this as attribute. Right now it is considered as attribute. Save it, go back to your browser, works the same. Let's refresh. Now, these are the ways a component selectors can be called. Now with that, let's proceed to our next section, that is templates. Now, speaking of Angular templates, there are types of templates here. But before we go ahead, let's have a brief introduction on what template is. So template is basically a HTML snippet which tells Angular or our Angular application as to what kind of component should be rendered into your application. Now, as you saw, a template is a tagline or bunch of tags that's been treated as HTML code and that will be rendered into your Angular's component. Now, there are different ways that you can perform or create your template. The first thing is inline template. Now, as we have already mentioned a little bit about that, so inline templates, as you can see, is something that has been called right in our template tag itself. Now, this is done in our decorator of component itself. It's given in between backtext and our whatever text is being printed within our div tag, and it has been given in our template tag itself. Now, we don't have to call any particular HTML file over here. Instead of that, we just give our direct message here. Now, this is obviously something that should be avoided because in a long run or huge codes, this wouldn't be preferred. But again, for demonstration or examples, you can consider this. Now, next one is template file. Now, template file, as the name suggests, you're adding a HTML file into your template URL. Now, if you have noticed, there is a small selector difference here. Here, you call it by the name template URL, and there in inline, you call it by the name just template. Now, the next thing is that interpolation. Now, interpolation is something that has been majorly used. So, I recommend practicing interpolation in every hard code or any coding that you practice. So interpolation is something, if you want to type a message and you want to avoid the redundancy of typing that particular message, you can use interpolation. So as you can see in this picture, SumProp is a keyword that has been used. So here in this SumProp, whatever I'm using here, I'm calling the variable over here. So using this particular variable, I will type the message. Now we'll understand more about it when we go ahead and see in our coding. But interpolation basically incorporates dynamic string values in our HTML templates. So dynamically, you can change your input text that you want to be displayed in your browser, and hence your text will be changed in your keyword section as well, like whatever you have given in your template there as well. So this will avoid you from changing it every time you want to change the messages. So now let's talk about template variables. So template variables is something that help you use data from one part of the template in another. So if you want to specify this particular variable in one part of the template, so you don't want to be using the contents of that variable everywhere. Instead, just use a variable because you have created a variable over there which is called as template variable. Now with this template variable, you can actually perform numerous tasks and respond to your user input and finally tune your application's forms. Now next is style URLs. So again, with style URLs, we can do modifications to our CSS file. Now whatever modifications that we discussed with respect to our HTML file can be done to our style URLs as well, which holds the CSS file. Now, if you're using URLs, use the file. If you're not using URLs, you can use just style. Now, this again will be specified in our component decorator, which holds this metadata. Now, let's look at some of the styling features of templates. Basically, for CSS, there is a context of each component which has selectors that can be used. Now, there are class names and selectors which is there locally for each of the component, and they do not collide with each other. And whenever you change the styles in the application, that does not affect any of the component styles. Now, when you're co-locating, this has been allowed in any of the CSS code for each of the component, even with TypeScript and your HTML code. Now, if you have to remove any CSS code without searching through the application, this also can be done. Now, let's go ahead and see our creation of templates and how we can play around with templates. Now, the first thing that I'm going to do in my component just I created is go to my TS file. And here, like I mentioned, let's try out our inline styling for the first place. So what if I give it within single quotes itself? So I'm just going to say h1 random message. I'll say demo message. Yeah. And I close this h1 tag. Close it. Now just save this. Of course, you have to avoid such kind of mistakes. Just save it. Go back to your browser. As you can see, demo message is being displayed. Now, basically what happens here is that whenever you display things like these, if it is one line, then you can go ahead and display within your single line. But I recommend you use backticks when you are using multiple line commands. Say I give my and save this. Just gonna go. As you can see, it's displayed. Now this is a good practice, so make sure you do this. So next, let's go ahead and see how our interpolation is done. Now for interpolation, I might have to erase the unwanted code here. There you go. Now here I am calling this particular property that I want here in my class, the class of the component. Here, what is the property that I'll be using? Let's say I use the property as title. Now what I want to do is I'm going to go here, specify title, and whatever message I want to give, say this is interpolation. I'm going to give it here. I'm going to save this. Let's see if this will work. As you can see, this works. Now, I hope you understood what is interpolation. I'll go ahead and explain again. So what I did here is, this is the property that I just mentioned in my theory. Now, whatever property I am calling over here in my inline, I'm specifying it in the class. Now, this is dynamically taking this property and taking the message. Now, if I have to change the value, I don't have to change here, instead change it here. Now, if I want to use this property elsewhere, I can go ahead and use it instead of changing my text every time that I want to use it there. Now, this is where interpolation comes into picture. Now, again, what I addressed is inline property. Now, for URL, what you saw was I used template URLs. This should be displayed in class format. So that will be our demo component dot component dot HTML. So save this. Now we can go back and see that this is our template file. So this is how all our template, inline, and interpolation works. Now, since we've completed all about our template URL, why don't we jump into our style URLs? Just like you saw our inline and all our template file, even styles can be done, as I mentioned in our video part. Let's go ahead and make the changes. Change this into styles. Save it. Let's go ahead and see in our browser. Now, before we go to our browser, let's add a small text here just to make sure that we don't want to say sample message, close this and change this into template, save it, go back to your browser. So this is a way that you can display your styles. Now with that, I think we've covered almost every concept with respect to template. Let's go ahead and see the next part of our tutorial. So here I'm going to be changing this, give this within backtext, and for me to give any style over here, I need to give a particular message. Let's go ahead and do that. So here in my message, I'm just going to say within backtext h1 sample message, and for our class h1 I'm going to say my color as red. Just close this. I'm going to save this. So it gave me an error now, which means I have to change both these properties as template and here as styles. I'm going to save this. Let's go back to our browser and check it. Now, as you can see, the property, whatever message that I have been typed in my template and whatever property that I gave in my CSS, it's been displayed here. Now, let's go back to our editor again. So here we have covered all the properties, which includes template URL, style URL, template, and styles for our inline messages, inline styling, and our interpolation as well. Now let's go ahead and proceed with our next session. So next we're going to be learning about Angular modules. Now basically a module defines what components and services wants to export. Now a module comprises of component, and in turn component comprises of HTML template as we have already seen, and also code. Now inside code it consists of service. Now this service will be interacting with our code in order for us to display the required output. Now basically there is ng modules. So these ng modules are a container for which cohesive code of block of code like your application domain or workflow can be closely related as set of certain capabilities. Now in every Angular application, at least one ng module class or root module should be there. Now in our case, it is called app module. We've already seen it. We'll again go through it. So here actually you can see a typical module architecture. Now some of the facts that's about Angular modules is that Angular application is a combination of Angular and modular system, which means they comprises of ng module. So as I spoke already, ng module is a basic block of code that has been dedicated to our application. Now they can contain components or services, and these all are because of ng module. Now they can also import functionality that is exported from ng module. Now these ng modules are other ng modules. Now the next thing we have in Angular modules is pipes. So pipes are basically built in and they are used for data transformation. If you need any kind of local information or a formatted data, pipes will be helping you to do that. So it basically provides built-in information for typical transformation of data, including transformations for internationalization, which code uses for local information to format the data. Now, there are several types of binding, as we've already seen. Now, this includes in ng modules or our Angular modules. So first thing we see is property binding. So in property binding, as we've already discussed about this, binding is needed in order for us to communicate between our component and template. So property binding is something that involves this. So property binding in Angular will help you set values for properties of HTML or directives. Now we'll get to what directives are in our further session today. So basically with property binding, you can do toggle of a button function or set paths programmatically and share your values between different components. Now next we have is event binding. Now, just like property binding, event binding is also used to share data between component and template. So it actually allows you to listen or respond to user actions like keystrokes, mouse movement, clicks, touches. Now it basically involves animation and transition, transformation, such things. Now next way is two-way binding. So two-way binding is basically a combination of bindings. Now it basically gives the components in your application a way to share any specific data. Now using two-way binding, it will listen to your events, update your values, and simultaneously this will happen between your parent and child components. Now in two-way binding, as shown in the diagram, one way is to change in view updates in a model, and the other way is to change model updates in a view. Now the next thing that we have is Angular service. But right before we go into Angular service, let's quickly go ahead in our editor and look at our Angular modules. So here, as you can see, there is an app module that has been created. Now this is created as in when you create your application. Now app module is only one type of file, which is of type TypeScript. Now here, as we have already spoken, it is auto-inserted or imported ng modules. Now with that, for us to have a platform browser, we have platform browsing or browser module also been imported. Now the rest of the imports are depending on the files that is being imported into your application. Now if you're using routing, that is also to be imported in your module. Now module is basically a repository to store all your imports in order for your components and your routing services to be working properly. Now, as you saw, like we created our component, we have to import our component as well in our module TypeScript file. Now, not only that, our module has a decorator ng module which stores all the declarations and inputs and providers for our application. Now, it also consists of auto-generated class, which is called app module. So in this class, whatever properties you want to be calling could be specified. Now, in our complex applications, we'll specify those properties. Here, since we are demonstrating, we do not have any such property to be displaying. Now, along with our providers, imports, declarations, we have something called as Bootstrap. Bootstrap will help us achieve our application's front end, and which comprises of our app component. Now again, app component is something that has been declared and been imported. So basically, module stores everything that you want for your application skeleton to be working properly. Now let's go ahead and learn about our services. Now coming back to services, firstly let's understand what is a service. So service actually comprises of model, directive, controller, and view. Now service class in Angular will help you deal with the pain of using repetitive code in several components. So basically, if you create a service in your module, this service can be used to create any number of set of codes using this particular service. Now, instead of calling the whole set of code in order for our code to work, we can use this service that has been created in our module class and create our codes. Now we'll see how that works. So it's a JavaScript class with properties and methods for sharing data between classes with unknown components. Now, even if the components are not interlinked, this service can provide you service to create any kind of methods or properties using our service. Now, it almost becomes tough to manage the code base of our app when the size of an Angular application grows larger. So this is when our service comes into picture. So usage of service will help us reduce the code redundancy. Also, the size of the Angular code can also be reduced. Now let's see how we can set up an Angular CLI. So basically we have already covered this in our previous session. So the first thing what we're going to do is we're going to install an Angular CLI. So in order for us to create service, it's important for us to create all the Angular steps which we have already created. And once we do that, a service will be created. So for that, we have already created our Angular project. We have already installed our Angular CLI. Next, we have to create a project. That also we have covered. We've used ng, new, and our project name. Next thing is to set up our Angular project. For that, we have to get into our directory, and we have already done that. That is cd and our project name. Next thing is we have to open into our browser. We've already covered that as well. And the next thing is to create our service class. Now this is what we'll see in our application now. So to create service class, we have to use this command ng generate service. Now we have to give the service name later. Here they've considered CRUD as our service name. Let's see what we can do in our application. So let's go back to our editor and see how we can do that. So here back in my editor, I'm just going to terminate my service and going to say yes. Once I do this, the next thing I'm going to do is, as you already saw, it's G for generate, or you can give generate as well. I'm going to say service. Now instead of service, you can also say S and our service name. I'm going to say my service name as, let's say, app serve, and hit enter. Now when you say this, a service will be created within our application. Now as you can see here, a service has been created. Now here you can see a TypeScript file has been created for our service. Also, a specification TypeScript file is created for our operating purposes. Now let's go into our service file and see what exists here. Here there is an injectable import, which means in order for us to have our service operating, we have to have our import injectable so that we can use this particular decorator injectable and store any kind of provided for our service to work. Now also, just like our module, we have our class of service which stores any kind of function which we want in our application in order for us to avoid redundancy of code. Now with that, our creation of service has been completed. So let's go ahead and see our next part of our session today. So the next thing that we learned today is directives. Now I've already mentioned about directives. Let's go ahead and see what they are. So directives are basically the classes that add additional behavior to elements in your Angular application. So as we go ahead in today's session, we are seeing how we can make our application more compatible and less code, which means avoiding code redundancy. Now, basically with this directives, just like our services, we can create a particular file or set of files using a particular command. Now, what will directives do is, it will basically manipulate your HTML, which involves your head and body. Now with Angular's built-in directives, you can basically manage your forms, lists, styles, and what users see. So all the front-end UI part will be managed by our directives. Now there are types of directives actually. So the first one we see is component directives, next is structural directives, attribute directives, and custom directives. Now I've already established that components consist of CSS, HTML, and our TypeScript. So basically in component directives, there is something called as ng class, ng style, and ng module. Now in ng class, it adds or removes a set of CSS classes, while in ng styles, it adds or removes set of HTML styles, and in ng modules, it involves two-way data binding, as we've already seen in our ng modules. Now the next that we have is structural directives. So basically what structural directive does is, it is a template which will control whether the template is to be rendered at runtime based on its import expression. Now if you want during your runtime for your template to be established or be displayed, this will be taken care by our structural directives. Now next we have attribute directives. So every element in our Angular will have certain set of behaviors. So all these behaviors is being maintained by our attribute directives. So attribute directives attach behavior to these elements. The next thing is custom directive. Now as the name suggests, custom directive simply replaces element for which it is activated. So basically if you want to custom or use your functionality or extended functionality of HTML, you define custom directives. Now with that, let's go ahead and see how our directives has been operated in our editor. Now in order for us to understand our directives, we're supposed to create a small demonstration. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to open my component class. Here I'm going to create a div, and inside div I'm going to call ngIf. Now ngIf basically belongs to our structural directives. Now in structural directives, there are two types. One is ngIf and ngFor. So basically ngIf and ngFor will give whatever is being to be required by our directives. Now firstly what we're supposed to do here is I'm going to go ahead and give anything that I want my ngIf to be displaying. Now let's say I want my ngIf to be displaying some property. So let's say the property is going to be a fruit. So here I'm going to specify a class name as well, which has the property name. I'm going to go ahead and say name, and whatever property that I want to be displaying, I'm going to give it as an interpolation. So let's say I want to be displaying fruit name. Now here, as you can see, one of the properties which includes in our structural directives is ngIf. Now one such property is ngFor, which involves our structural directives itself. So similarly, if you go on creating div tags using each of the properties ngIf, ngFor, you will be creating a set of properties which will establish your directives. Now we do that when we create a huge application. In the end, when I display the application and working, I'll be showing all the properties of directives. For now, this is how you create a directive. Now let's move on and understand our next part of our today's tutorial. Now, dependency injections are nothing but the services or objects that a class needs to perform a particular function. Now, it basically means that if you want to add a dependency injection, it means you have to inject a service into that dependency depending on what function you want the operation to be done. So dependency injection is basically a design pattern in which a class will request for a particular dependency from external source rather than it creating by itself. So in order for us to create dependency injection, we need to make use of services. Now, when you create a service, there is a decorator that has been created known as injectable. Now, this decorator will specify the specific service for that particular Angular in our dependency injection system. So basically, there is a metadata known as provided in, which has its operator as the root, which means that service is visible throughout the application. Now, when you inject other services into the constructor, depending on that service, the service will be triggered. So we'll understand all this when we create our service. Now, speaking of injecting our services, basically anything that you inject as a particular service, it will make it visible to a particular component. Now, if you want it to be visible throughout your application, you can go ahead and specify your service in your module. So to inject a dependency in a component, you need to use the component as a constructor. Now you can specify any particular argument inside your constructor function depending on your type. Now there are different varieties of services when you add a particular service into your injection. So there are certain specifications that you need to consider while adding your services. So when a service depends on another service, there is some sort of pattern that is to be followed in injecting into your component. So when a service depends, a logger service is to be reported where all its activities are being noted. So first you import a logger service. Next you inject the logger service in a service constructor. Now this is done by specifying a private logger. Now this is done within a parenthesis. Now there is another thing called constructor which specifies a type of logger and stores the instance of logger in private called as logger itself. Now with that, let's go ahead and see how our dependency injection is being done. So the first step in order for us to create dependency injection is to create a service. Now I've already done that by using ng, which is for generate, service, app serve. This is done in our service section itself. So let's go ahead and create our injection. So for that, as you can see in our services.typescript file, we have the decorator injectable, which means we can go ahead and proceed with our dependency injection. Now what we have to do is we have to create a function. So let's go ahead and do that. So here in my class app serve service, I'm going to create a function known as getMessage. And here in my function, I'm going to give a return statement where I'm going to return, just say Edureka. Now I'm just going to save this. And now our service class has been ready. But what we have to do is we need to make sure that our service class is being registered depending on where you want your service to be accessible. Now, if you want, as we discussed, our service to be accessible within a particular component, just go ahead and create your service in that particular component. Now, say what if I want my service to be accessible in whole application? So it is always recommended when you want a service, you don't know which component to be accessible to that service, you can just go ahead and create your service or register your service in your module. Now, doing this is a couple of steps. So the first thing that you have to do is you have to consider providers, like I've already mentioned in my theory. Over here, I'm just going to call my service. Now, what is my service name? AppServe. Now, AppServe service. Now, once I do that, I also have to go ahead and import my service. So for that, I'm just going to say import AppServe, which is my service name, obviously, and this will import our service. Now, as you can see, our service has been imported automatically. So I'm just going to undo this and save this. Now, the next thing is to import in our particular component. So we're doing this because we want our service to be accessible through our message. So I'm just going to go ahead into my component TS file. So again, in my component TS file, the first thing that I'm supposed to do is I'm going to import my service. Now, once I do that, just going to hit save. I'm going to go ahead into my app component class and create a message. Now I'm going to say a message and say string. It is going to be of type string because whatever message that we are typing in our service is of type string. Now in our constructor function, we are going to pass the parameter private, and then we are going to call init, and inside our void, we're going to see what message we want to be displayed in our browser. Now, once you hit save, you should be able to see the message. But in order for us to see the message, we need to give a particular interpolation. Now, for that, I'm going to go to my HTML. Now, here in my HTML, whatever message that I want to be typing, I'm going to give it within my header tag. Now, since I've given my message already, I'm just going to give it within interpolation. So my message has been saved in message. Just save this. Now, if you compile, you should be able to see our message. Now, once I have compiled, here, as you can see, my message has been displayed. Now, as you've already seen, we have not particularly given any particular message in our HTML file. Yet, our desired message has been displayed. Now, that is because we've used our services. Now, using services is because of dependency injection. Now, using injectable, that is our decorator, we have used our dependency injection and hence created service and used that service in order for us to display this particular message. Now, we have done that using module. So let's quickly go through on whatever operations we have done. So the first thing that we did is, firstly, we created our service and then we went to our services. Through our injectable, we created a class, and inside our class, we created a function which is known as message, and hence we returned that particular message. And using this particular function, we went back to our module, and here, having our service been imported, we made sure that our service has been called in our providers. And once this is done, we went to our HTML, made sure our message has been typed here. Next, we went to our component TypeScript file, made sure our message is of type string and created a private serve. Next, on init, we call that particular message, used this operator in order to trigger this message, and hence called our function getMessage. Now, with our message being interpolated here in our HTML, we had our message typed in our browser. Now, with that, our dependency injection is successfully done. Let's move ahead into our next session. So the next thing that we have is Angular routing and navigation. So basically, what is routing? Now, basically, when you want to use routing, you have to involve a particular set of navigation. Going from one page to another is our routing. So here in Angular, it is a process of partitioning an application's UI using URLs. Now you can use particular set of URLs in order for us to navigate from one page to another. So it basically enables programmers to create modern single-page application with numerous views that may be loaded once the browser is being activated. Now again, it enables navigation from one view to another, as I already said, in order for us to perform a particular user-defined task. Now there are steps involved in performing routing and navigation, which is basically known as the life cycle of routing and navigation. So the first step is when URL is being detected, its redirection is being applied. So we'll see that in an application. Now the next step is the final URL. That means when you match the URL to our router state, it proceeds to our final URL, which takes to our destination page. The next is our routing state. And here the process of guards and resolvers are being involved. And here again in our routing state, when we have to navigate from one page to another, this state is being occurred. And here we have next process, which is to activate user router outlet. Now again, the final step is to navigate and update browser's location. Whichever the destination page is, it shows us in the final step. Now with that, let's go ahead and see how our routing and navigation is being occurred. Now here I've considered a small process. This demonstration, here we see how we have created routing switching from one page to another. So the first step is to create our routing services. Now if you remember, while creating our application itself, we have created our routing services. Now, while creating our application, since we created our router services, you can see that there is a app routing module that has been created. Now it is a TypeScript file. So if in case you have not created the routing services while creating your application, there is a command that you have to give in order for us to create a routing services. So let's go ahead and see what that command is. So in order for us to create a routing build project, we say ng, G is for generate, C is for component, anything that is your routing demo, maybe. This is your project name. Say dash routing. This will create a routing based application. Now when you hit enter, you'll have a bunch of files that has been loaded. Now once you do that, you'll have these files that has been loaded. Now the next step is to create components. Now this is there because in order for us to create our routing services, you need to make sure there is at least two pages which we can redirect from one page to another. So for that, you're supposed to create at least two components. So here in creating components, there is a slight difference in our regular components to our routing oriented components. Here in our routing oriented components, in order for us to create, we say ng, go to the command prompt, say ng, G, C is for component, give a component name, say student is your component name. In case of routing, in order for us to make sure this is a student component, just say dash IT. Now IT is for I is inline text and IS dash IS. I again is for inline and S this time is for style. So inline text and inline style. Do this and hit enter. Now this will create our component. So here I have created the component called as student list. Now doing this basically, as you saw, normal component will create a bunch of files. But here giving inline text and inline style will generate only a TypeScript file. Now that is what we need to create our routing. Similarly, if you go ahead and create the same kind of component with inline text and inline style for teachers, you will get another TypeScript file known as teachers. Now with this, we can implement our routing. We'll see the next step what to do. Now here, as you can see, it is student and teacher. Now with that, we'll proceed. So as you know, our next step is to call our components or import our components in our module file. But here, the twist is that there is a routing module file where we have to import our components. So we'll do that. As you can see, it is auto imported. Now once that is done, our next step is to call our routes. Now, whatever routing we are supposed to perform is to be called in a path format. As URLs is being passed, it is to be called in path format. Now, this is being done in our routes. So going ahead, we'll see our routes. And here in our path format, I have added students, as I've created a component called student list. I've created a component student list, and my path for that students will be students. So how this will be addressed is, whenever you go into your browser, when you see localhost 4200, when you say /students, whatever record you need to be displaying in your students, it will be shown. Similarly, if you say /teachers, whatever records you need to be displaying in teachers, it will be shown there. We'll see that when we get into the browser. Now the next step is to export our components. So whatever routing components that we created, we're supposed to make sure it has been exported. So here what I've done is, I have created a routing component as my const. Now with that, I've used const because whatever path I'm passing here is into our const routes. Now with that, I have created a variable known as the routing component, which stores the array of student component and teacher component. Now, why I'm doing this is, if you go back to your module, here I have to be calling both student component and teachers component as my import. Now, instead of that, since I have created a routing component and added both the components into this routing components, I can simply call routing components in my module instead of calling my import statement individually like it is done here. Now, since it is done here, I don't want to be doing the same thing even in my modules, main module TypeScript file. So I'm just going to go to my module file, and here instead of calling student and teachers, I'm going to say routing module and routing components, which means it stores both student and teachers, and follow my input command. With that, I'm also going to declare routing components in my ng modules. And don't forget to import your routing module, which will be auto done once you create your routing. Now, wherever you imported your app routing module, you can call your routing components also there itself. Now, this will reduce our redundancy of the code. Now, as I explained, routing components is here in my app module.typescript file, imported my routing module, and whatever routing components I have created as my array, I go back to my module TS, call that particular variable which has my array of both the student and teacher. Make sure that has been there in your ng module also. Now, as I suggested, make sure you have imported app routing module as well. With all this, we can proceed to our next part. So next is our final step. So the final step is to display our output. So for that, what I'll be doing is, let's just comment all this for time being. Now, as you saw, router outlet is the tag that will render your routing module into your app component. Now, this should be done for us to display any particular routing into our browser. Now, that has been done by our router outlet tag. This has been specified in HTML. Now, the next thing that I've done here is simple div tag, and within div tag, I've given a class for styling, and then just a simple message saying routing tutorial. And here, with this done, our output should be working. Let's go ahead and give our ng serve in order to check our compilation and see our output. Now, as you can see here, it says routing tutorial, as that is what is the message that I have entered in my HTML. Now, let's go ahead and say /students here. Now, as you can see, it says student list work. Now, student list is the component that I have created. Student list works is the auto-generated message in my components. Now, similarly, when I say teachers, it says teachers list work. Now, obviously, when a user is using routing component, he wouldn't go ahead in the URL and change the URL in order for him to see from one page to another. So for that, let's go ahead and create a button which will take him automatically into that particular place. Now again, as you saw here, the template that we just created here is teacher list, and template that we created in our student is student list. We have already seen how we can do this in our template section. Just within the backtext, give your p command or div command or any other tag that you want to specify. Give your message here, and hence you can give your styles as well. I've kept my styles empty. I don't want any particular style at the moment. Since that's not my preference, this is what is being done there. So now, like I said, let's go ahead and create a button. How do we do that? Go to our HTML, and here, as you can already see, I'm just going to uncomment this within the nav tag. Why nav tag? Because I want my button to be in a navigational bar. Now, generally, these kind of interlinkage pages will be present in our navigational bar itself. So I'm just going to go ahead and give it a nav tag. Of course, you can give it a div tag as well. Now, A is because I'm going to give it within an anchor tag. Now, I'm just going to say or call the button as student, and hence just give a button tag, student. Make sure it is enabled. You don't want it to be disabled because it wouldn't work otherwise. And our router link should be students. Now this is an important declaration. Make sure you link your router, because once you click the student, you need to be redirected to our URL students. And similarly, once you click teacher, make sure it is redirected into your teacher's URL. So giving router link will do the work. Save this again, make sure it is compiled, go back to your browser, check this here. Now, as you can see, by default, it is in your teachers section. Once you say teachers, it says teachers work. Once you say students, it says students work. Now, just go back to your home page. Now with this, you can click and again click this. This way, our routing and navigation is implemented. Of course, you can implement this in your complicated applications as well. The basics stays the same. With that, let's proceed to our next part of our tutorial. In fact, our last part of our tutorial, which is Angular Forms. So Angular Forms is some of the important topics in our Angular, because obviously for creating your UI, you need any particular form. So with that, we'll see what is forms. So here in Angular Forms, just like any other forms, you can basically take input and you can correspondingly show your input. So handling user input with forms is the cornerstone of many common applications, just like your Angular form application as well. Now, applications use forms to enable users to log in, to update, to enter any sensitive information. In fact, Google's Forms is one of the main used Google applications. Now let's see what are the types of forms that we have in our Angular. We have two types of forms mainly: reactive forms and template-driven forms. Basically, reactive forms is the most complex one, while template-driven forms is most commonly used one, and it's pretty simple as well. So in reactive forms, it provides direct and explicit access to your underlying forms object model, while in template, you have indirect and you have to create your template in order to manipulate your underlying object model. Now, in fact, compared to React Forms, it's pretty scalable, reusable, and even testable. But template-driven form is easy. So you can create template-driven forms. It might not be easy to test and reuse, but then it is easy to create, and it is used in small applications like email, sign-up forms, and things like these. And in reactive forms, the key part of your application itself is reactive forms. So for building your application, you mostly use reactive forms, not the template forms. Like I said, template forms is basically used for your sign-up procedures. But again, template forms is pretty easy to add into your app, and it doesn't scale away like that, just like your reactive forms. Now, with Angular Forms, you find set of form controls. So what is form control is, it helps you in privacy of your forms. Of course, when you create a form, you don't want it to be accessible to everything and everybody. So our privacy check is being done by our form control. As you can see in this picture here, form control in reactive forms is because it has direct access to your form object, and there is something called as form control directive that has been created in your reactive forms, which will maintain and help you in controlling your privacy. Now, speaking of template-driven forms, there is an ng module. As we've already learned about ng module directive, ng module helps you in creating and maintaining your data in your forms. So with that, let's go ahead and have a brief look at our forms and how we create it and types of forms involved. So in creation of forms, there are some basic methods that has been involved. Of course, you need to create a project and then hence create a component. Here I've created a component called form demo. That's just to show that I'm having a demonstration form here. Now, there are certain things that you need to consider here. Firstly, in your module TypeScript file, we need to import our component. That is our basic thing that we've been doing. The next thing here specific to our forms is that forms module. So we import something called as forms module in order for our forms to work hassle-free. Now, once we do that, make sure you import your forms module here in your imports as well. Now, our forms is ready to be built. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a component called form demo, as I've already mentioned. Here, since I've created, let me just open. So when I create a form demo, I'll have a TypeScript file. So here in my TypeScript file, there is nothing major that's occurring here. An import, make sure all your selector, template, and style URLs is in place. Next, we go to our HTML. So here in our forms, since forms are something that is UI oriented, make sure it is in right format. So we work majorly on our HTML file of component itself. So the first thing what we've done here is you have to import a form. And for this, you can find any particular form in a Bootstrap website. So just go to your Google. If you just say Bootstrap and go to your forms Bootstrap, here you'll find a basic code for forms. Just copy this, paste it in your HTML. What you'll find is this kind of form template. Now this is just the basic works without any form controls. You can go ahead and paste it in your HTML. Now that's what I have done here. The next thing that we have to do is make sure your forms is in right place. So for that, you're supposed to give a basic styling. Where do you give the styling? Now we have implemented our whole forms. So since the whole form is here, giving styling in our component itself doesn't work. So I'm going to go ahead into our main styling page and import this particular URL. Where do you find this? Well, you can find this in your Bootstrap website itself. Go there, make sure you copy the URL. The whole thing will be displayed over there. You don't have to worry about the syntax either. Now, once you do that, come back to your HTML file and make sure your form is in right place. For that, let's go ahead and check in our browser. So once you have your form, this is how it will look. Now, of course, nothing would have happened here. All this validation I'll speak about in today's session. So this is how your form should look. Now, where I have given this, I'll let you know. Now, coming back to my editor here, I have created a div tag here in my component HTML, main root component HTML file. That is app.component.html. Now here, a basic Edureka. It's just for appearance sake with my basic styling class, and make sure to call your component with this tag in order for us to render our component. Now going back to our HTML component file, the first thing that we're supposed to make sure that our submit button is working is by giving ng submit. Now once we give ng submit, it will trigger the submit button, and we can use the submit function to submit our form. So with that, we'll use the submit and then create an ID login. With that, give an ng form. Where do you use this? here, just like I have created my submit function, I create a function called submit, give login. Now any as a type that you give, even if you don't give, it might work. Now the next thing is I say console log form submitted. Now before you log in or give your parameter as login, if you just say console log, it will make sure that your form submitted is being displayed in your console. Now let's go ahead and check that. I'm just going to take this login out and not give any parameter here as well. Just going to take this parameter out, save this, go back to our browser. Now here in my browser, make sure you inspect. Now once you inspect here, just say submit, go to your console, hit submit, it says form submitted. Of course, because I've not given my login as my attribute, it wouldn't show as form submitted here itself. Now let's go back to our editor and specify our login. I'm just going to say login here as well as pass as argument in my console log. Now back in my HTML, mention your login here, save this, go back to your console, say submit. Now you have your form being submitted with all your requirements. Your form group is being added. Now with that, you have ng submit also being called. Now let's go back and see how all these works. Now here in my HTML file, I have created an ID login. Now giving my class form group will make sure all my entities are being added into my forms. So make sure you have given form group for every input that you add. So I have given two inputs here, email and password. So form group is given to both of the input. And similarly, we have input tag and label tag, both for passwords and email. The next thing is submit, adding a simple submit button, just like it was there in your form. Now make sure you give ng module to both your inputs. I'll explain why you give ng module. But before that, make sure you give ng module even to a name reference. Now you have created this variable reference because whenever you need to take input from the user, make sure that input is being taken to the forms. And whenever you take input to the forms, make sure you create a reference model. So let's go back and see what this ng module actually does. So since you have created ng module and added ng form, it will actually help you bring all the attributes of forms. For example, if you go back and check in your body and head, as you can see, it has added all the references like ng module, ng untouched, ng pristine, ng invalid, including form control. Now all this is not being given in your class. You didn't specify as your class, but giving ng module, it will auto-generate everything so that you can make your form workable. Now similarly, giving ng forms will instantiate all the ng submitted, ng invalid, ng untouched and pristine. So this will make sure that your form is in the working state. Now with that, we can proceed to our next section. Now here I'm going to create one of the topics that we discussed earlier, directives. Now ngIf is something that involves directives. So here why I have used ngIf is, if I have to add validation into my forms, I need to make sure that validation is done for a couple of things, not just for invalid email. Even if the email is to be required, say for example, you have not given any email and entered submit, it needs to give an alert to the user that you have to give the email and it is a required attribute. So in order to indicate these kinds of messages to the users, and you have to use multiple messages, make sure you use a nested if as well. So here what I've basically done is, name is the template reference variable, touched is the attribute, invalid is the attribute. Now where do you find these? Again, if you go back to your browser, you can see here there are many things that has been popped up. Now invalid, if you click here, it says true now, but otherwise it would say false. Now similarly, touched. So these are the triggers that says when you touch or if the email is invalid. Now considering these attributes, you can give your if statements. Now here I have considered that. Give the class that you want to display in order to show the user that particular alert, and then give your statement. Now, since I have used two particular references to indicate my user, say if I want my user to understand that this field is required, I'm going to say required. And if I have to tell the user that use the minimum length, and in order to say that the email used is invalid, I've used invalid. For that, my ngIf comes into picture. Again, involving directives here. With that, I can save it and my validation has been occurred. So if we go back to your browser again, now here in my browser, if I say it's going to take, how do we check that? Inspect, it says form submitted. Now say I don't give any value, it pops up with email is required. Now how is this displaying? Now let's go back to our editor and make sure we give this particular styling for us to have this email is required popped up. Now remember, we have to do that in our components CSS file, as we are indicating only this particular component to display email is required. So let's go back to our editor. Here in our editor, I'm going to my CSS styling file. I'm going to alert danger, and for that alert class, I'm going to use black color. This is for my text. And alert danger, I'm going to use background solid red. With that, we complete our forms operation. Here, we've not only covered forms, but also validation. So here, we can step into our next session, which is testing. Now, in testing in Angular, there are basic steps involved. But why is actually testing required? It will help you check if your app is working exactly as you expect or not. Now, any application that you build, it's important for you to test as well. Just building the application might make you assume that the application is working perfectly. But in order for us to make sure that it is working completely, we need to test. Now, there is a step involved in testing. Now, Angular helps you complete testing process in just one particular command. That is ng test. Go to your command prompt, just type ng test, your testing will be completed. Now, why don't we check this for our application that we just created using Angular Forms? So, in order for us to test, we need to make sure our Angular CLI has been installed. We've already done in all our applications that we just created. So, we can make sure that our testing is occurred here. But before we do that, let's go ahead and see testing components. So a component is basically a part of Angular application which comprises of HTML and your TypeScript. Now, component truly is the template and the class working together. So to understand testing, we need to make sure every component is working together. And there is something called as testbed in Angular, which facilitates us in order for us to make sure that our testing is complete. Now, testbed is basically when huge applications is being created in our production environment. With that, let's go ahead and see our testing. So this is my forms application. I'm just going to go to my terminal and terminate my action. Here, I'm just going to say ng test. Now, as you can see here, while we give that command, it's compiling each of our testing components. Now, as you can see, our router component has been tested, compiler has been tested, and number of testing operations is occurring over here. Along with that, as we can see, there is an automated test software that has been controlled by Chrome that's generated here. Now, Karma is something that has been used for us to test. Now, with that, our testing is complete. So here, our testing is completed. So Karma is a version that has been used for us to perform the testing. As you can see, it says debug. You can also debug the application tested right now. With that, it shows number of testing errors and all the misfunctions that has been occurred while we tested each of the component. As you can see, while testing, it is component wise. Firstly, it has tested my just created component, which is form demo component, and then it has created an app component for my testing. Now with this, we complete our testing as well. So this brings us to the end of today's session. But before that, let's go ahead and brief and learn about whatever we learned in today's session. So firstly, in order for us to understand whatever we learned today, let's look into the job requirements that one Angular recruiter will look into. So the first thing an Angular recruiter will look into is HTML and CSS. In today's session, we've already covered our HTML basics and CSS. Of course, you need to make sure that you're thorough in your HTML and CSS. JavaScript. We've covered our JavaScript section as well. We've covered all the basic requirements for JavaScript. Also, we have covered the frameworks involved in JavaScript as well. Now we need to have a good architectural analysis of Angular. As you saw, we have covered architectural analysis of Angular as well. With that, knowledge on modules and components is vital. We gave components, created components, saw what goes into modules, and created certain things in modules in order for us to understand. We also created services, injected directives, and etc. With that, our covering of knowledge on modules and components is done. The last part is single page application building. We also built single page application building with our forms. Now using routing, we also navigated from one page to another. With that, we covered everything that we need as an Angular developer. The next thing is for us to understand where can we get certified as an Angular developer. Now, Edureka offers a full course training in order for you to have a certification in Angular. You can go ahead and check out the link given in the description box below if you're interested in getting certified as an Angular developer. With that, you can also go through the blogs that Edureka writes, which has number of opportunities and interview questions that you need to go through as an Angular developer. I hope today's session was helpful in order for you to become a successful Angular developer. If you have any doubts regarding becoming an Angular developer, regarding any of the topics that we dealt with today, you can put it in the comment section below. Until we meet again next time, happy learning.
I hope you have enjoyed listening to this video. Please be kind enough to like it, and you can comment any of your doubts and queries, and we will reply them at the earliest. Do look out for more videos in our playlist and subscribe to Edureka channel to learn more. Happy learning!